Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Thompson, and I understand that I was on mute. And thank you very much. I'm unmuted now, and I get to say everything I just said once again. So thanks for those notes from the audience letting me know that I was muted. We are going to be joined today in our presentation by Kathy Marks, and Kathy has been extensively engaged in the writing of COVID plans, working with many of our clients on helping them return to work. But in addition, she serves in a leadership position at her place of worship and has been engaged extensively in the, returning to services, engaging in the safety and security aspects of her place of worship, and has been engaged in the community in the same capacity. So we're really honored to have Kathy today. And Kathy, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words to our audience as we get started. Well, we can't hear you, Kathy, so maybe you're muted. But either way, we will have you joining us.
I was muted. Sorry. I apologize for that. Thank you, everybody. We're very happy to have you here, and anything that we can do to help you is our pleasure and our honor. So thank you, Steve.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kathy. All right, when I begin the presentation, I'm going to go off camera and we'll go ahead and present. I will be watching to see, Kathy will be monitoring your questions. We will take any questions that you have. If we don't have the answers for them, we'll do our very best. So why don't we go ahead and just do a couple of housekeeping items. First off, thank you very much to the Heffernan team for today's webinar. They do have a number of other webinars that are up and coming. There's one coming up just in a short period of time, July 20th. It's exempt versus non-exempt. And all of these can be found either on the Heffernan website or at aspenrmg.com, Heffernan Webinars. And you can see what's coming up for the rest of the year. In addition, Heffernan does preventing sexual harassment. And there is an additional event coming up on August 24th, 2021. Again, all of this available as part of your Heffernan relationship. So with that, now you've learned a little bit about us. I'd like to start our presentation, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first, you've had a chance to get to know us. Today's session will be what churches, including daycare. I'm going to go ahead and mute my camera. What churches, including daycare, preschool, need to know about Calosha's new COVID regulations. The focus of this presentation will be on the work environment. That would be, of course, for employees and volunteers, independent contractors, and those related to your organization. Where we can touch on other aspects, we will. Having Kathy here will be helpful because we plan on doing a Q&A with her in a little bit on a few particular areas. And I will try to pause about 2 seconds after each slide. So Kathy, feel free to interject if there's something that we need to cover, and I'll do my very best to do that pause.
Will do.
Thank you. All right, so with that, we'd love to learn a little bit about you. One of the things that we always try to do on our webinars is to engage our audience. This will be an engaging process, so I'm going to go ahead and launch a polling question. If you're on a cell phone, you may need to tap the screen to be able to get this question to come up. If you are on a tablet, you may need to do the same thing. You simply just click on the answer on your screen, and we'll give everybody just about a minute to do that. Okay, I can see we've got a great audience, Kathy, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, and I'm going to share it with all of you so you get a chance to see who is on this call. So we have 72% of you that have daycare and or additional operations, either school or otherwise, religious institution or organization only, and then 3% of peripheral and 6% others. So great to have all of you on the call today. Appreciate you being here. Okay, we have a thank you that we'd like to always put out to our men and women and our families that support our armed services, and those especially in the past year relating to our front line, whether it's police, fire, medical teams that have been engaged. We really could not have survived this year and a half without all of these amazing organizations and people to help us get through, especially our first responders who have been just remarkable this past year and a half as it relates to COVID. We do have a quick disclaimer. This is a changing, what can I say? It's a changing world, especially in California as it relates to COVID regulations. For those of you, I'm sure all of you followed the Supreme Court decision, 5-4 decision, relating to overriding the California governor's mandate against religious institutions. And so this is a very fluid situation. And so our disclaimer is, look, as of yesterday, as of the 14th, this information is accurate, but we are seeing changes either being forged through the courts or being forged through other regulation, either emergency orders, outbreaks, other things that can occur. So we're current as of, in the last couple of days, and that's just something to be aware of. Although this session is being recorded, just know that it won't stay up forever, because we just know that things are going to change. We have another question for you. We'd like to learn just a little bit more about your thoughts. How would you rate your current Calosha regulatory knowledge? How confident do you feel at this point in time? Just take a moment. Are you an awesome expert as it relates to your COVID regulatory knowledge, especially relating to your workforce, i.e. Calosha? Give us a sense of where you're at, and that way Kathy and I will definitely deliver for our entire audience. But if we have any awesome experts or some of you that have some good information, please share it with us as we go throughout the session. We always like to engage our audience. We always like to hear what our audience has to say. We have everyone voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share it with you so you all have a chance to see. Well, Kathy, we don't have any awesome experts today. We do have some folks, 5%, with a little more knowledge than most. 35% feel they're on par. 32% are in the early stages, especially with the changes in the organization, and 27% not sure. So we will be sure to cover everything from the basics all the way to the newest regulations. Okay. All right, so where do we go from here? Well, I show the agenda so that you have a sense and you can get a timing perspective of where we'll be at. This session tend to go through 10:30, and if there are a lot of questions afterwards, we can still continue to take those. And even if there's questions where most people have to go, you can always email us, and we'll have that information up on the screen, and it will come to you as a follow-up in an email about a day later. Either it'll come tomorrow, or it'll come on Monday, where we'll have a copy of the presentation, a link to the recording, and all materials that are part of today's session. And we do have some great materials, including some template plans that Kathy built, and a number of other items that are available for you. We will just go ahead and get started, and we'll start this off with a dilemma that we have as organizations. And I think religious organizations have been facing these doors all throughout since the start of COVID, and the decisions that have to be made to protect congregants and members, staff, and others. And the door on the left represents one way to go under the Calosha regulations, and the door on the right offers another way to proceed. What you'll hear today is you'll hear about both doors, and you'll also hear our recommendations that perhaps the door on the left is perhaps the best way to go, where you don't have to follow as many regulations, but you may have the leadership or the thought process that you are okay with additional regulations, and you'll take the door on the right. We'll cover both doors and cover that information today. And Kathy, I'm pausing only to see if there's anything that we need to cover before we move forward.
No, I think you're good. Thank you.
Hearing that, we'll go on. We'll do a very quick key strategy. As I mentioned, the door on the left would mean you do the same things you've been doing from a Calosha perspective with employees, whether people are vaccinated or unvaccinated. The door on the right means that you will separate your employees from vaccinated and unvaccinated, and you'll have different rules for each of those groups of people. Let that sink in for a moment. We'll have a different safety plan for vaccinated people than you do for unvaccinated people. So we'll just let that settle in, and we'll go through a little bit of quick history lesson here, not to bore you with how we got to where we're at. In California, prior to the end of November, we used what we have in place already to manage COVID. We have what's called the Injury and Illness Prevention Plan, and most of you probably have that plan in place. And we use that and all existing regulations to manage COVID-related issues. And then there was an emergency standard that was passed at the end of November, and that applied to all places of employment except those that fall under what we call ATD, or the aerosol transmissible diseases. Those are organizations that already have to deal with that, i.e. hospitals, healthcare, and maybe even dealing with certain types of industrial environments. Then on June 15th, we were going okay until we were following under those emergency standards. And then on June 15th, we did a California reopening under the governor's order. And then that sort of did disrupt Calosha's intentions, because their standards board had determined their own path of reopening. And that did not align with the California reopening plan. So there was a little bit of scrambling. And on June 17th, the governor issued an executive order. And shortly afterwards, after that, within 10 days, the new standards were essentially codified. And we have a link to those of what they are. And there's essentially a number of standards, and we'll go through them today as to what they are. Our focus will be on what some of the changes are, because we know that all of you have been living with this for the last year and a half. So we're not going to belabor all of the stuff you've been doing. We're going to talk about the changes and how you can, best maneuver within this changed environment. The emergency standards are expected to end January 14th, 2022. They were previously set to expire October 2nd. And of course, we don't know where they will expire, whether it will be January 14th, which is what we think they will, but it could be somewhere in between that. Okay. There are some exceptions to this standard, and of course, work locations where there's no contact with anybody else, i.e., a single location. Of course, people working from home don't necessarily have to, they don't fall under this standard at all. Now, if they're a hybrid and they come into the office and they also work from home, well, and they're in the office working with other people, then this standard would apply while they're in the office, of course. And then employees that telework, where you as the employer don't have control of that environment. Maybe they travel for a job, maybe they go work at other companies where maybe you don't have full control of that employer. And then those employees that fall under the ATD, or the aerosol transmissible diseases. For those of you that are familiar with that, we already mentioned that, might be healthcare, other places like that. That's a little bit of that exceptions to the standard. So not really a whole lot of exceptions. Most of us fall into that category. Well, the things that are the same as before are things like this. You still have to have an effective written COVID prevention plan, or your CPP. There still has to be training and instruction to employees on the plan that you have and their rights. There still has to be notifications to, of course, all of the agencies, public health department, for any outbreaks. There still has to be notification to employees, no change there. There's an offer of testing that still has to be done for potential exposures. And of course, any has to be some sort of response. Kathy refers to a lot of these areas as doing math. I know she'll explain it a little bit later, but I'll leave it at that. And then, of course, the same things apply with quarantine for staff and exclusion pay. There can't be anybody, they still have to be paid for their time. And then basic prevention requirements as it relates to housing and transportation. We're not going to go into the housing and transportation issues today. We have, though, included in our slides, we have like 100 slides, and what we've done is we've included all of the details, including all the definitions, all the details on housing, all the details on transportation. Everything is in the presentation that you will receive. We just won't be talking about all of it today because that'd be many, many hours to be able to go through that. All right, when we take a look at the COVID protection plan, these are the standards that are required under this plan, and I think that we'll just go through them relatively quickly, but it's important to know, especially for our audience that said you feel you're in the early stages or on par. And for those of you that have a little more knowledge than most, certainly we welcome you to share with us your thoughts and ideas. So in this particular plan under your CPP, the elements are the same as before, but let's do a quick refresher. Under communication, this is everything as it relates to like how to report COVID symptoms. This has to be done as a way to, without fear of reprisal for employees. You have to be able to communicate what the hazards are, i.e. the COVID-19 hazards. Communicate what the best practices are. Deal with employees who request a respirator. We'll get into that a little bit later. The fact that employees can wear face coverings if they like. Where an employee can go for testing if necessary. And a particular notice about potential exposures to COVID-19. That's essentially how this works, including benefits. You've got to be able to communicate what the benefits are. In addition to that, we have the identification and evaluation of hazards. This is, if you look at most of this, this is very similar to your injury and illness prevention plan, except that it's focused on COVID. We also recommend that your CPP be separate from your IIPP, meaning that you don't combine the plans together. If OSHA were to come out, do some sort of inspection, they ask for your CPP plan, you provide that to them. That's it. You don't provide them anything else. If they ask for your IIPP, then you provide them that. If the two are linked together and there happen to be something in your CPP that you're not tracking well or you're just getting started on, you don't want to expose yourself to those particular liabilities. The other thing is, unless it's asked by Calosha, for any other policies, you give them what they request. Not anymore, because you don't want to work yourself into a potential for liability. So there has to be a method in place to identify and correct hazards. You can see that a little bit further down on the list. So there has to be some process in place for screening employees, and we'll get to that a little bit later. There has to be some a review process in place for your evaluation of your practices. So you just can't set this up once and then say, oh, I'm done with this. If things change in the environment, if there's an outbreak, if there's an exposure, you really do have to review this. That's different than an IIPP, where there really is no formal process to review it. We do recommend looking at it once a year, but in California, there isn't a requirement per se for you to, annually go through your plan. But as it relates to your CPP, it's important to review your plan, and especially when there are changes, to make sure that it's current. There should be some sort of site-specific evaluation of where COVID transmission could occur. So that could be maybe at the front desk, it could be among employees that work in close proximity. There has to be some sort of site-specific evaluation. And I won't go through every detail, but you've got to make sure that there's a process in place that immediately addresses any COVID cases. And that could involve periodic inspections of your facility, and you've got to have some sort of process in place to correct hazards and, of course, to correct issues that are going on as it relates to COVID exposures. An investigation process, you'll notice that this is very similar to IIPP, that when you have an incident in the workplace, you have a requirement to do an investigation. It's the same way here, and that is you've got to have an investigation and a response plan in place. You've got to find out when that case was last in the workplace. You've got to determine who was exposed, potentially exposed. You've got to have a process in place to notify the employees about testing, and then making sure that employees are excluded from returning to work if until they are no longer a potential exposure or risk. Those are all part of the investigation process. We already talked about correction of hazards. And then the training and instruction, again, very similar to our IIPP. You've got to talk to your employees about your policies and procedures. Now, that isn't necessarily just Calosha policies and procedures. They're your own. And we'll get into that just in a little bit about how your policies may differ from what Calosha is guiding you on. That's okay as long as it follows a more strict process. What benefits are available, again, have to be part of that training. And there are some sort of controversial topics that you've got to train your employees on that may be questionable for you, but you still have to lay them out in a way that are clear. One is you have to share with your employees that COVID-19 is an infectious disease and how it can be spread, of course, through the air. You've got to advise people on the proper use of face coverings, and then the conditions where face coverings have to be worn. So you can see there's a whole process in place for training and instruction, and we'll go into a little more of these details in a bit. Face coverings. I'm not even going to talk about that here because we'll go into that in a little bit, but face coverings have to be 2 layers or more, and to ensure that they're worn over the nose and the mouth when indoors or in vehicles when you're going to be sharing that ride with somebody else. There are some exceptions, of course, to face coverings. It's when you're alone, or it's while eating or drinking, of course, provided employees are 6 feet apart. Still that physical distancing only during those circumstances. And then there may be somebody that has a medical or a mental health condition or disability, or a hearing impaired person, where there could be some limitations on actually wearing a face covering, where maybe a shield is necessary or some other particular process. The other times you wouldn't want to have people wearing face coverings is if it creates an additional safety hazard, which might get into the way of operating some sort of equipment or otherwise. And that could be an issue. One of the questions that many of our clients ask is, can you as an employer require an employee to wear a face covering at work, even if the employee provides documentation that they are fully vaccinated? Now, we're going down this path of the 2 policy procedure, but yes, you can have a policy that has everybody wear a mask, because that would be considered stricter than those required by the emergency temporary standard. We'll get into this a little bit later. The only thing you've got to be aware of is you've got to have an accommodation for people who can't wear face coverings due to some sort of medical or mental health condition. And we'll go into that a little bit later, but I wanted to put a star by that and let you know that there is an option there with face coverings that I want to talk with you about. And then you got to have some controls in place. The typical things that we talk about in safety and health is what's called engineering, administrative, and personal protective equipment. And that just means that you've got, under administrative, you've got cleaning procedures in place. You've got you clean areas where maybe there was a COVID case or an exposure. You want to make sure that your engineering controls that there's the maximum amount of outside air. Talk with your HVAC people. We'll have a slide on that a little bit later. And then personal protective equipment. Kathy and I will go into more detail on this in a little bit. But essentially, what changes in this regulation is that you've got to provide the option of a N95 respirator for employees that request one. We'll go into that a little bit later. You've got to provide some particular guidance from Calosha on that. It's called Appendix D. And then reporting and record keeping and access. These are all sort of very similar to what already exists in California as it relates to regulations for reporting an injury or illness. And if there is a serious occupational illness, those are the types of things that are reported to Calosha within 8 hours. Let's discuss what that means, because it's the same thing that exists now. So if an employee exceeds sort of 24 hours of observation in the ER, or they're admitted to the hospital, that has to be reported to Calosha within 8 hours of notice of that. It's just a phone call. You let them know, hey, I'm not really sure if it's work related, whatever, but we had this person, they had COVID, it apparently happened at work, wanted to let you know that this happened. That's the first one. Of course, if somebody passes away from COVID and it's work related, you have to be able to notify Calosha of that also. So no changes in that as it relates to reporting serious illness or injury. The only other areas that we recommend people getting a real comfort level with is when to report to your public health departments, because depending on the county that you're in, this can vary. And Kathy and I have been down this road with the various counties because there's different reporting. In general, it's within 48 hours, but we can't say that about everywhere because Santa Clara just undid their reporting requirements, which were more strict than others. And it's important just to look up your public health department and determine what their parameters are for reporting. What is a close contact? I guess that would be the next area. An employee has had a close contact if they're within 6 feet of a COVID case for cumulative 15 minutes or greater in any 24-hour period. This is, to say the least, this is highly different than the rest of the country. And when this came out, Kathy had to read it numerous times to make sure that she was clear on this, because that's what Calosha is saying, and that is, if you've got a cumulative time, that could be 2 minutes at this time, 3 minutes in an hour, another 5 minutes later on, 15 minutes of cumulative time within a 24-hour period around a high-risk exposure. We call that the high-risk exposure period. That's what's considered a close contact as it relates to Calosha. I know that sounds a little odd, but that's what they've determined. Certainly, you want to exclude from the workplace employees who test positive for COVID-19, so there's an exclusion there. And you want to exclude employees, after a COVID-19 close contact, unless they're, quote, fully vaccinated before the close contact or recently recovered from COVID-19 as described. So there are a number of particulars around this cases and employees who've had close contact. It's important to recognize that this becomes a math issue because, as Kathy will say, you've got to start counting, 10 days have passed since the last known contact, and if the employee has developed any symptoms, they can be returned. It's a matter of pulling up the standard, which we have later in the definitions, and just counting backwards. I'll let Kathy comment on that if you wouldn't mind. Kathy, can you just kind of share your experiences in dealing with this close contacts and cases and counting?
Sure. And, first off, I want to say as well, a lot of religious institutions, you may not have a written COVID prevention plan. You may, and that's fantastic if you were provided one. I do want to say that, Steve, maybe what we might want to do is send out a sample with this presentation so that everyone's kind of up to speed. This is the original COVID prevention plan, and then you can just tweak it based on the changes that just occurred. So I wanted to offer that in case you don't have one. But as Steve said, it's very clear in the regulation when we talk about 15 minutes cumulative in a 24-hour period, in the exposure period, which is the 48 hours before that person tested positive. So if you, let's say, have an employee that came to work on a Wednesday, tested positive that evening because they weren't feeling well, you're really looking at that close contact Monday, Tuesday for everybody who came in contact with that individual. If they came in on Monday and they had very little interaction with anyone and they tested positive Monday, the last contact was Friday, so you probably didn't have anyone who might have been involved or had that close contact. So it really is sitting down, understanding when they felt ill, when they got tested, who they were in contact with. Now, that also, of course, as we're talking about, this is for employees. Remember, OSHA is just for employees. It is not for your congregation. Your congregation, how you manage that exposure, we'll talk about later. But this is our responsibilities to our staff, not the congregation. So thanks, Steve. Hopefully that helped.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kathy. And then finally on our list under your CPP is the return to work. How do you bring somebody that's had a COVID-19 case back to work? Well, there are a couple of particulars that have to be, followed. One is at least 24 hours have passed since a fever of 100.4, and that's to be maintained without, quote, fever-inducing medications like aspirin or ibuprofen or Tylenol or things like that. That the COVID-19 symptoms have improved, of course, and at least 10 days have passed since the COVID-19 symptoms first appeared. And then there's some parameters around that if people didn't have symptoms, then it would be 10 days since the COVID case first positive test. So there's a number of real, particular, aspect. And one question that comes up frequently on our webinars is a negative test, COVID test, required for an employee to return to work? And the answer is no. The standard doesn't require an employee to have a negative test. The criteria for returning is just what we talked about before: the temperature, the symptoms, and the 10 days. So that's a little bit of a misnomer, but it's the way that it is. We have some key strategies that we're going to go through, and this is the first one, and that is employers may require all employees, fully vaccinated and unvaccinated, to wear face coverings indoors. This removes the majority of documentation, tracking, and segregation requirements. Now we're gonna sort of harp on this a little bit as we go through. All of the policy and procedures we went through in the CPP, of course, are all required in the work environment. Many of the new changes that have come into place reflect the difference between a vaccinated person and an unvaccinated. And Kathy, this would involve anybody that's working in the environment, including volunteers, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So any employees, any volunteers that you have in the organization. So this is a key point that we're going to talk about, that if you decide to have two policies, that's a different way, and we'll talk about that. Or if you decide to have only one safety policy, where all of your employees that are wearing face coverings, you have that option. We'll go through that. It's not written into the code, but it's applicable. Okay, we have another question for you, and we always like to ask our, now that we've talked a little bit about our COVID protection plans, how confident are you that your COVID protection plan that would stand up to Calosha? And we'll give you a moment to share with us where you think this is at. Again, I think Kathy's idea is great. When we send the resource link out, we'll make sure that we have the CPP template plan. By the way, do not download the CPP plan from the Calosha website. Even they recommend not using their CPP template at this time. And until that plan is updated, they're not recommending using that. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks ago, I was on the Calosha webinar for the standards meetings, and they reiterated again, don't use our template. I'm not going to go into the reason why they would have posted it in the first place, but that's where they feel it's not up to par at this point in time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. I'm going to share that with everybody so you get to a little bit of across the board, almost split down the middle. We have a 15% very confident, 26% mildly confident. So we've got a nice combination up in the strong, feeling pretty good about it. And then the rest of you not sure, don't have a plan. So Kathy, good idea for us to make sure we get everybody to plan. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Come back to this. So here's the real important changes, and we've put this all in one spot to give you sort of a summary of this, so that when you get your this presentation in an email, you'll be able to jump to this page and make sure that you know where you're at. So a couple of things that really start to separate employees between vaccinated and fully vaccinated. The way that the press says it is that, fully vaccinated employees don't have to wear a mask at work, and so that's the law. And the challenge with that is that if you, the employer, decide you don't want to follow asking people about, their medical conditions, asking them about maybe their preferences as it relates to religious beliefs or otherwise, then you just would have employees wearing masks. But doesn't quite say that in the regulation, although I did ask the question 8 times to Calosha, and they finally answered me at the end saying, well, yes, you can go all with masks and you won't have to follow most of the regulations that we laid out, splitting up your employees. So a couple of things to note here is that there is a new provision that Calosha put into place, and it relates to something called N95 respirators. And you're saying to yourself, oh my gosh, what does that mean? Why do I have to have employees in respirators? Well, Calosha's sort of interpretation of this is that the CDC and the World Health Organization and the National Institutes of Health are still recommending physical distancing, 6 feet, without masks. And Calosha said, well, we're going to do away with physical distancing, but we think that respirators will be a much better solution for the prevention of COVID than the physical distancing. It's a decision that they made, and it's a decision that now all California organizations have to comply with. So we're going to go into that in more detail right now. And Kathy, I'm going to ask you to please join me on this discussion because this gets a little complicated, but I want to make sure that our audience knows this. And we ran into this question before, and so we added in these slides from doing a previous presentation because it really was one that kept our audience kind of questioning the differences between an N95 respirator, a surgical mask, and face coverings. And N95 and surgical masks are what we would consider PPE. They are used to, quote, protect the person wearing the device. This is well known in industry. For those of you that have been in an industry where, whether it's healthcare or you've worked in a job where you've worked in a factory or otherwise, that these types of devices are made to protect you, the person wearing the mask. Face coverings, that's a totally different story. Those are made to be used for what they call a source control, meaning that your droplets, your exhausted, expirations are things that they believe that the face covering will prevent from passing on to somebody else. So that's the difference between the N95 and surgical masks and what we consider face masks or face coverings, which is what most of us have been wearing since the start of COVID. A key point about any mask or any N95, and that is because the filtering piece is on the outside, when you remove this mask or when you take it off or when you handle it, you shouldn't be touching the outside of the mask, the front of it, because that's where stuff is going to accumulate. So just be aware of that. That's sort of common sense, but just be aware because then maybe you're going to take your hand and scratch your eye or you're going to, do whatever with your hands, and that's a concern. Or when you're sitting down to eat a meal and you take off your mask, if you hold the front of it, now all of a sudden you're eating your food using your hands, and now you've exposed yourself to whatever's on the front of that mask, which has been filtering. Okay, now we have an X by that little mask that's on there. And Kathy, I don't know if you want to talk about the differences between N95 and that N95 with the button. Maybe you share with our audience your thoughts on that.
Sure. So it's okay to wear the surgical mask, if you will, the face covering, and an N95. So for unvaccinated employees, if they ask, To have an N95, the N95 that you want to provide them or have to provide them if they ask is the non-filtering face piece. The button mask, or the one that has the X through it, that has a filtering face piece that protects the wearer, because as that person breathes in, that little button has a filter in it, and that filters what they're breathing in. Remember, we're wearing N95s to protect others. That's why unvaccinated people are supposed to wear a face covering and N95 if they request it. Now, the reason that we showed these half-face respirators, the cartridges and the one in the front, that's not what we're talking about. You are not to provide that. That is a whole separate requirement from a Calosha perspective. We're only talking about if someone requested who is not vaccinated, then it's the N95 without a filtering face piece that you have to provide. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's great. And we've included sort of the 3M/industry standard on how these are supposed to be worn. And a respirator, has to have what we consider a tight seal. That's why they have the double straps, etc. And if it has a metal piece at the top, you should bend that over so that that's worn in there, that filters against the mask. In addition to providing the employee with an N95, if requested, you also have to provide them something called Appendix D, and we've included it here and the link. And essentially, it is a guideline for employees to use, how to use that N95. However, there are some challenges with this, because in the real world, if an employee requests an N95, you would allegedly just hand them Appendix D and allow them to just wear the N95 should they desire. But in the COVID standard, there are some aspects of this that are a little bit different, and that is you are supposed to train or guide or instruct employees on what an N95 is. You are supposed to comment to them if they should happen to have facial hair, that's probably not a wise decision to wear an N95 with facial hair. That's not going to work. That only works well when you have a clean shaven face. So there are some real complications in here, and we've laid out what the standard is and how it works. And again, we show the other masks there to show you those are not N95. You see, they don't say N95 on it. This one says N95. That's the type of mask that you want to issue. Now, we're going to talk about this. And go ahead.
Steve, I'm sorry, this is Kathy. I did want to answer a question, and it's a really good question. What is the difference between an N95 and a KN95? Well, it's all about certification, right? The N95 is based on American certification standards. The KN95 is made in China, and the KN95 is based on their certification standards. So the KN95 does not meet the American standards for protection and certification. A lot of times they're cheaper, a lot of times they're a knockoff, but the KN95 is China certified and the N95 is American certified. So you always want to get an N95, not a KN95.
Exactly, because we just don't know if that KN95 is going to meet the N95 standards, which is filtering out 95% of, the transmission, aerosol or otherwise, through that particular mask. So thank you, Kathy, for clarifying the difference between KN95 and N95. That's a good one. There is a point to this that we wanted to make, and that is, Kathy said something that is written into the regulation, but we want to sort of make sure that you understand that if any employee were to request an N95, they should be provided it, not just the unvaccinated. Because if an employee is reading about the various variants, I mean, by the way, the CDC is still suggesting that masks be worn in workplaces. It's Calosha that's saying, well, if you're unvaccinated, you need to wear a mask, and if you're vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask. But the CDC is still suggesting that everybody's just stay in masks. And we're suggesting to just stay in face coverings, because that way you don't have to have two policies, one for vaccinated and one for unvaccinated. If somebody requests an N95, you provide it. Now, we're going to have some strategies on how to deal with this in a few minutes. Okay. If you have to have, this is one of the aspects, if you're going to have an area where employees are being screened. So let's say, for instance, you decide to have employees reporting to work, vaccinated, unvaccinated, with mask, without. You've got to have a place that this can be screened. So how do you do that? Well, this has to be a particular location where you have to be able to protect that screening location from the rest of the organization, because if somebody is screened in that moment and they don't meet the particular screening requirements, then they could be sent home, or they could be an exposure or otherwise. So just recognize that when there is a screening location, that should be somewhere isolated. So you've seen when you go to a healthcare organization, it's outdoors, those types of things. It's best to contact your HVAC provider, especially if you're talking about outdoor air. They are much more familiar with the necessities around dealing with exposures to the air quality. The investigation process, we talked about that already, but we want to make sure that you've got to include a notice sent to various people. We've included the details here. We're not going to go through them. The other aspect here is the investigation, which we talked about earlier. You've got to make sure that you do take an investigation seriously. You've got to make testing available at no cost during paid time, i.e. working hours for employees, or at least paid time, even if it's after work, still have to be paid. And the way that Calosha is dividing up employees is saying that employees who are fully vaccinated before the close contact and don't have symptoms, we're not suggesting you even follow that you just treat everybody the same as unvaccinated. Don't try to go down the path of trying to determine who is or who isn't vaccinated, because that leads down a whole nother set of regulatory issues that you've got to follow. So when these pieces are talking about a fully vaccinated person, we're hoping that you'll just take the path and just say, we're going to treat everybody as unvaccinated. There has to be the training, and you can see how the Calosha has started to interpret and putting vaccinated people and unvaccinated people in separate categories. And all of this goes through all of the new regulations. We think it's probably to encourage vaccinations. That's why they've sort of separated this out, but we don't really know for sure. But we're just bringing it up because all of these changes really is about people who are vaccinated and who are not. And again, the Calosha is saying for all people who are not fully vaccinated have to wear masks, etc. And we're suggesting that everybody just continue to wear a mask, because that way you don't have to get into all of these various policies and procedures about following things differently from vaccinated and unvaccinated, tracking new employees. When the new boosters come out for Delta or Epsilon or or whatever variant comes out, you don't have to start tracking that. Just treat everybody as unvaccinated and you're fine. Unless the unmasked employee is either fully vaccinated or tested, again, we're just bringing up the point that all of the new regulations are based on the separation of employees and volunteers, whether you're vaccinated or not. And then again, more about being separated, whether you're vaccinated or not. Again, more on vaccinations and whether or not you are. And then we already talked about return to work. Nice comment from a quote from Winston Churchill: if you make 10,000 regulations, all respect, you destroy all respect for the law. And there are quite a few regulations that have come out. We've included all the regulatory sections for Calosha, and we really want to spend some time now, Kathy, to ask you a few questions. First of all, tell us a little bit about some of the biggest challenges you've had serving in leadership in your religious institution. I think that will help our audience quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I just wanted to let everybody know that I am on the board of my place of worship, and I have been for many years. I've head up the security for the last 20. Now I'm in a leadership position, and certainly we've been dealing with this. I do want to kind of tie in my comments, if I can, with a couple questions that have come up, which I think is really important. One is, can you require employees to be vaccinated unless providing a doctor note that exempts due to medical condition? Well, it has been deemed over the last 12 months, and the jury was out almost literally to decide whether or not it's legal to require any employee to be vaccinated in order to come to work. It was deemed that it is appropriate, but you need to have a written policy in place. Don't just have it, yes, we're requiring everybody. Many religious institutions are requiring at least their preschool teachers to be vaccinated because, number one, the preschoolers aren't old enough to get vaccinated, and many of preschool parents were not initially old enough to get the vaccine. And so in order to protect the kids and in order to protect the staff at least in interacting with the kids, which kind of led to all staff at the religious institutions to being mandated vaccinated. So I'm just saying, get a labor law attorney involved. Every webinar that we have attended, spoken to our legal team, is that if you are going to mandate vaccines for your staff, make sure you have a written policy in place, because there are going to be exceptions. What are you going to do if somebody refuses? Will you terminate them? How are you going to handle it? So from a legality perspective, make sure it's in writing. Another
Kathy,
question came, yeah.
One point about that is that if you should have to have somebody with a medical exemption, you have to accommodate them or have a process in place to deal with accommodation under the ADA. Be aware that these cross into various areas, and Kathy's absolutely right. The EEOC and the DFEH, which we put links on here to those both policies and procedures that do allow you to mandate vaccines, but be aware if you go down that path, whether it's accommodation for medical or otherwise, you've got to have a written plan, as Kathy says, in place, and by all means, make sure you vet it, because this is still FDA approved, but only for emergency use. So the vaccine's still being tested, and the only case we have right now as precedence is a group of hospital workers in Texas who the judge did throw out their case and said, no, you need to be vaccinated. But that's a healthcare institution. That's not a religious institution. Thanks, Kathy. Go ahead.
Yeah, good point. The other kind of caveat to that was, can you require volunteers to be vaccinated? That is a whole different ball of wax, and they're not your employees. You can determine whether or not you want a volunteer to be vaccinated. That is a slippery slope because, again, remember, OSHA is only for employees. Now, as a religious institution, you're a private company, right? You can determine and make whatever rules you want. We never required volunteers to be vaccinated, but we did require, and we still do require, every single person who comes onto campus to wear a face covering whether they are vaccinated or not. We're not asking our congregants if they're vaccinated. Let me back up for a second. I'll address that later. Volunteers, everyone wears a face covering, and that way we are not requiring any volunteers to be vaccinated. We've just concentrated on staff. In our case, we did mandate all staff to be vaccinated, and that was the choice that we made. One of the other questions that came up, do you have to check employees and or church members' temperature before they are allowed to come into the facility? What if they refuse a temperature check, or if they have a high fever, how can we respond? Well, number one, remember, you can have COVID and not have a temperature, number one. So from an employee perspective, they can self-attest to their own health. there's a form that we have provided in the COVID plan that you can use that everyone should fill out every day. They are allowed to attest for their health before they come on site. We also have a platform where preschool parents attest for the child's health before they come on site. I can't remember what the name of it is. I don't want to even say, but it is a platform that you can have the parents do that. As far as congregants go, however you decide to have your services, what we have done is we have split the services up. Of course, most people have been doing online services during the bulk of the pandemic where people were not allowed inside the sanctuary. Now what we have is we have vaccinated only services so that people sign up ahead of time. They show us a copy of their vaccine card. We don't keep it on file. We don't keep it because that's private information. We keep a list of who is vaccinated, who isn't. We have vaccinated services, and then we have unvaccinated services outside in our courtyard so that anyone can attend, and masks, face coverings are optional outside. Face coverings were mandated inside, even for vaccinated, and we've just waived that requirement. So if someone is not feeling well and they insist on coming in, well, that's where I hope you have a security company that you're working with, because that is your home. That is your pastor's home, your rabbi's home. That is your home. And you do not have to allow someone in, certainly if they're ill, because they could get everyone else sick. So hopefully no one's insisting to come on site if they are ill. Now, I just want to also mention, because this is all about the congregation, how do we handle congregants refusing to wear a mask? Certainly it can make life a little bit difficult. It can be a very delicate issue. We have been very clear in communication, and at first, again, our services were only open to vaccinated members, and we were requiring face coverings, even for the vaccinated services. We have just eliminated that requirement. Now, some people are still wearing face coverings with vaccinated only services, and that's fine. If they are not vaccinated and they are refusing to wear a face covering, then they're violating your policy as a private organization, and you have every right to have them not come in. Now, again, it's easier said than done, and it really depends on, of course, your culture. It's balancing the warmth of welcoming with these regulatory requirements, but I just want to tell you, you as an employer have an obligation to protect your staff, and if you have an unvaccinated congregant or a congregant that is unwell, they are going to interact with your employees, and you have a duty based on OSHA to protect your employees, and that individual is a hazard. So you have every right to tell them you cannot come on site because you are an employer protecting your staff. I hope that helps.
That's very helpful. And one of the things that I think our audience, will and what we've heard from many religious institutions is that some organizations have had to take the path that you've suggested, Kathy, which is to have multiple services. Others have included everybody in the same service, that they just continue to wear masks and work with that. Others have made other decisions. And as Kathy said, as an organization, you do have to have a plan in place to protect your workforce. Calosha is not going to be concerned about your culture of your faith. They're not going to be concerned about, what's working for your services or not. All they're going to be concerned with is, are you protecting your employees? And again, we're coming back to this very simple process that why take the chance of allowing your employees to come in without masks because they say they're vaccinated, by just having them wear masks? If you have your employees wearing masks, that fits with the compliance of the CDC and the World Health Organization at this point in time, and therefore you are going above and beyond what Calosha says, because Calosha is saying, well, if you're fully vaccinated, or we make accommodations for you, then you follow this set of rules. If you are unvaccinated, then you have to wear a mask, or maybe you can request an N95. So it's a very, very complicated set of circumstances, and we're coming up to the bottom of the hour, and I wanted to shoot a couple of quick questions out while we close out. Will, let's talk about citations for a moment. Will Calosha issue citations for employers who don't implement all the provisions that came out on June 17th? And they won't, but they want to make sure that you're moving in this direction. So if you don't have a CPP plan, if you don't have a plan in place to deal with exposures to employees, it's time to get started. If you haven't taken a poll of your employees, if they want an N95 mask, it's probably time to start doing that. You probably need to have some on stock so that you have them available. We're going to include a link where you can get these. We have no tie to this. This is listed at Calosha. These are all organizations that have, hundreds of thousands of masks available, authorized by the state in some way. So this is important to note. You don't have to have everything in place now, but you've got to be showing that you made effort. Coming today is a good first step. Going through these materials that we send to you. Are the physical distancing requirements gone? Yes, they are, except for various exceptions. Could be an outbreak, could be where, a major outbreak. We recommend continuing the physical distance for employees and wearing masks at this point in time so that you don't have to go down the path of potentially having people use respirators. If you do, you still have to offer them, but you might say, hey, we still have our physical distancing practices in place. So if, you can wear the respirator if you want, but just know that the reason that Calosha has done this is because they've said that you don't have physical distance anymore. Well, if you as an employer decide, hey, we're going to keep our same thing, you go to your office, you could take off your mask. If you're roaming among the employees and walking through the hallways, put your mask on. You have to provide a respirator to your employees should they request it, to anybody working among others or in a vehicle with others. And that's just the requirement of it. We recommend that anybody can ask for one, not just unvaccinated. The Calosha says unvaccinated people may request one. That doesn't make any sense to us. If a vaccinated person, and by the way, if you don't ask the questions, whether you're vaxxed or unvaxxed, then who's going to know who's requesting? So we're still suggesting don't go down that path, just take the path. What does it mean upon request? It means that if somebody asks for one, that you have to make an effort to provide one, and at some point in time you will. And again, you've got to provide some guidance. Again, poll your workers first. Don't go out and buy thousands of masks. Again, this is not for your congregants or your parishioners or otherwise. This is for your volunteers and for your employees. Make sure that you poll them first. Hey, do you feel, if we're going to all wear masks, do you feel that you want to have a respirator? And if somebody says yes, then you can order some. So nobody says they want respirators, probably order 10 or 15 so you have some in stock just in case. What if you run out? Of respirators? Well, you got to make every effort to try to get them. Why is Calosha requiring respirators to be offered to unvaccinated persons? It's kind of a useless question. They're just going down this path of separating people between vaccinated and unvaxxed. Who has to wear face coverings? Again, we've already gone through that path. We recommend having all employees wear face coverings. I go down the path of anything else. Do you have to have full documentation for a fully vaccinated employee to work without a face covering? Absolutely. This cannot be some on your honor plan. This has to be very detailed written plan, identifying proof of vaccination, whether it's a vaccine card. It also can be self-attestation, but that has to be done on a formal process. You got to keep a copy of this on file. You got to make sure it's monitored. These are fully vaccinated, by the way, not just after the first shot if they're going with the two. Got to maintain these records. You got to keep them in private. They got to be separate from the personnel files. Got to be with the medical records. And then, of course, they can self-attest. We suggest don't ask the question. Have all employees wear face coverings. That way you avoid all of the medical and all of the other exemptions and the accommodations. And what if, again, if you're asking and they decline to state their vaccination status, well, then you have to treat them as unvaccinated. That's pretty much it. And then whatever your policies are for unvaccinated, which is pretty much the CPP. And again, don't ask for proof, simply have all employees wear face coverings. May an employer require its employees to be vaccinated, as Kathy said? Yes, however, and then we've identified the particulars here as it relates to that. It's always an assumption in a religious institution that everybody working there is of the same religion. That might not be true. There are 15 faith-based organizations that are more faith healing or otherwise, or there may be some people who say, well, you know what? Fetuses were used in the development of the vaccine, and I don't believe in that. And so they're not going to be vaccinated, or they've already had COVID and they believe they have natural antibodies. Point is why are we going down that path? So there's two doors to take. One on the left is stay the course of what you're doing now, have face coverings in place for all employees and volunteers. And there's the other course, whereas you want to divide up, as Kathy talked about, that plan they're using at their particular place of worship. And they've had to do the multiple steps in tracking. We would love it if you'd give us one takeaway from today's session while we also ask a question about how we did. Or if you have an additional question. I know, Kathy, your keyboard's been going along answering questions for our audience. But
sorry.
No, it's okay. It's good. Can you, from an audience perspective, can you go to your chat or your question box and just tell us one thing that you took away from today's session, or send us your questions? So, Kathy, I don't know if you have anything in the hopper we need to answer. Go ahead.
I do. I wanted to address some really good questions about a preschool located in a church building. Do we follow licensing through the child licensing, or do we go by OSHA guidelines or the licensing guidelines? That's a really great question. Don't forget, OSHA is for your employees. Now, the licensing requirements for the daycare should not be contradictory, but it may require, like, here's an example. Daycare licensing was requiring the cleaning of the playground equipment and cleaning of toys. That was to prevent the spread for children to children, or maybe you had your children in pods, right? So the same children were in the same pod every day so that they weren't kind of interacting with other children. They had the same teacher, and they did that out on the playground. So it's not independent, but you want to make sure that you're following the OSHA guidelines for the staff, but you also have to make sure that the child care licensing may require over and above. It just can't be less stringent than what OSHA is asking. So I understand that it's going to kind of be both. The other question was...
I was going to say, Kathy, that's a great point. We've been doing a number of various inspections throughout the state of California on behalf of various licensing, or to comply with various licensing, whether it's daycare, whether it's home care, or otherwise. And you're absolutely right. There can be variances, and the point is that there's the employee, the employee regulations. You've got to weigh this out depending on the circumstances. Kathy, one thing though, I would like to launch our last poll. Just want to know from our audience how we did today. We're not going anywhere. We're still going to answer questions. We're still going to be here. If you could just take a moment to let us know how we did. We want to be able to share that with our folks from Heffernan and let them share that. So if you can just take a moment to share with us your thoughts. We're not leaving. We want to continue to provide our Q&A session. And again, we apologize for going past the hour. We do tend, though, that the Q&A portion is a pretty important part to this. Okay, well, thank you very much for voting for this. We really appreciate it. We're going to close that. And Kathy, we'll come back to the chat or question box.
Okay, great. Yeah, because there's some really good feedback here. Also, if we are fully staffed independently from the church, can they still require our staff to be vaccinated? Yes, they can, because remember, now, whether or not you do that, part of your kind of tenant agreement, remember, they're trying to protect their staff. They're meeting their OSHA requirements. If they feel that they need independent contractors, tenants to be vaccinated, and that's their policy, then they can certainly ask you to do that. So they're looking at it from a employee protection perspective. So hopefully that helped. One question, your recommendation for all employees to wear face coverings would mean during worship services as well as in the office during the week. What about volunteers that are in the band or other worship participating roles during worship? Well, again, it's up to you. So yes, we were requiring even vaccinated congregants to wear face coverings. Our clergy, our band was up on the front of the elevated surface, and they were 6 feet apart. We had, a couple guitar players, and they were 6 feet apart, and they were far enough away from our congregants. Now, that also means, remember, from a staff perspective, you have to check your ventilation and make sure that there's good ventilation. We set up extra fans to kind of move air around. So again, during COVID, once we started opening up again, that was our decision because our clergy felt that the last thing they wanted was to have an outbreak coming from our congregation. So we probably went over and above. Hopefully that helps. That's up to you. If you want your band members to wear face coverings, they did not. They wore face coverings at the very beginning during the service, and then they took their face coverings off. We just separated people because we were only limiting 34 people, 36 people in the sanctuary at one time, and we've just opened it up to 50. Then we're going to open it up to 100. So we had very limited people in the worship service to limit and increase that physical distancing. Are we responsible for groups that rent space in our building? If they are going to expose your employees, you're not responsible for them, but you are responsible for setting the tone. Either isolate them from your employees or make sure that they are wearing face coverings and 6 feet apart if you're not going to mandate masks. So again, think of, and the way OSHA wants you to look at it, as hard as this is to say, think of every single person that they interact with as a potential infectious person. That is exactly what's in the regulation. So just like you would have an unguarded piece of machinery, if you have somebody who rents your space, you have to look at those individuals as potentially infecting your employees. What are your recommendations about employees who preach or sing without masks? Again, it really depends on how many people are in the sanctuary, how you've set up your ventilation system. If you have people more than 6 feet apart, and especially now that the CDC guidelines are a little bit less, if you know that those who are preaching or singing are vaccinated, then there's less of a chance that there's going to be some sort of a spread. But again, people who are vaccinated can still spread COVID. Again, it's your culture, however you want to do that. I know someone was surprised recommending face masks during worship kind of was an eye-opener. I can tell you that after we had these vaccinated-only services, many people now are, and we agreed, they can take their face coverings off during those services. But at the very beginning, when vaccines first came out, we still weren't sure what the vaccination contagion was with vaccinated people. So yes, people do feel that they have earned the right not to wear a face covering going through the vaccination process, and we've respected that. But again, we're also limiting. We are not at full capacity for the congregation yet, so people can still spread out. If you have mandated vaccines for employees at preschool, do teachers legally have to wear face masks? Again, it's your policy. Our teachers are wearing face coverings even though they are vaccinated, because it has been shown that even if you're vaccinated, you can still give someone the COVID disease, if you will. And because preschoolers cannot be vaccinated, we have decided that our teachers are still going to wear face coverings. So yes, that is the policy. And again, that's up to you. I'm glad this was helpful. Still don't understand how this applies to the children in our care. I understand the employee aspects. Do we rely on the state information regarding masks on children? Yes. as far as the state goes, that is what, now we have set up a safety and health committee made up of a lot of doctors that are part of our congregation. The kids, whether or not you require kids to wear face coverings outside, we have just allowed our kids not to wear face coverings outside, but inside they are still wearing face coverings, again, because they are not vaccinated. And their parents, a lot of them are not vaccinated because they're in their 30s, maybe late 20s, and they are not vaccinated. We can't mandate our parents to be vaccinated. So again, we're kind of protecting our staff, but also understanding that we do not want to spread COVID within our congregation. Can you wear a face shield instead of a face covering? No, you have to wear a face covering. You can wear a shield in addition, but you can't wear it in lieu of.
Kathy, that's a good point, and that is outdoors. The Calosha standard has changed, which is you can go maskless or face uncovered outdoors. And there have been standards that have been developed now for K through 12, and it appears that in California those children will be masked those are returning. Until the studies indicate otherwise, there have been some studies that children, perhaps from JAMA, have indicated that children should not be in masks. But at this point in time, California is one of those states where they're in school, they're most likely going to mandate that masks are going to be, I believe it's K-12. I think it's maybe even younger, Kathy. I thought it was any child 2 years of age or older.
Yeah, it's 2 years or older.
Right, 2 years or older. So that's the current California standard.
I do want to, right. I do want to just mention, someone has all church members are members of our corporation. What does that mean for the church's liability for its employees? Sir, I don't know. I think you need to check with your, an attorney to see how that corporation was written up. I don't know if church members are now considered employees or co-employees. I don't know that relationship. So
yeah, if they're members and stockholders,
I can't answer that.
I was going to say, Kathy, if they're just simply stockholders, like in a company, it wouldn't apply to them as employees. But if they are actual employees, i.e., getting a paycheck, then that makes them an employee. Otherwise,
right. I don't think that's what he means. Yeah.
Okay. If they're volunteers,
no.
That's a different set of circumstances. But
right.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you require the preschooler children to wear face coverings even on the playground? Yes, you can require that if that's what you choose to do. Remember, the CDC are guidelines. You can go by the CDC. You can make it more strict if you feel that the children are no longer in pods. So when we had the kids in pods, like again, we broke our playground into all these different little sections. The kids were in the same classroom, in the same playground. We opened up the pods. The children do not have to wear face coverings outside, but they are wearing face coverings inside. That was our choice. Can you repeat what you said on face shields? Face shields, that plastic face shield, cannot be worn alone. It is supposed to be worn with a face mask, right? So when someone is not, so let's go what OSHA is saying. If you are unvaccinated, right, and you are supposed to wear a face covering, you can't have them wear just a face shield. They're supposed to wear a face covering underneath, unless there's a medical reason why they cannot. And that is why it gets very complicated, and you might want to, again, check with the labor law attorney to make sure that you have the policies in place if there is an exception where someone cannot cover their face because they have asthma or they cannot breathe.
Or hearing impaired, where you have a work environment.
Or hearing impaired.
People, certainly the shield would work, and you use your 6-foot distancing. So it's a matter of determining what can be done to protect. So 6-foot distancing and shields, if you're hearing impaired, that would be perfectly fine under the standard.
Right. And the last question, and then we'll let everybody go. I understand a respirator protects the wearer, but it also protects others. It really depends on the type of respirator. So again, the N95 with the filtering face piece, or let's just talk about these button masks. Some of you may be familiar with these face coverings that has a little button. That's a filtering face piece. That protects the wearer, right? Because it's filtering what they're breathing in, but it does not protect others because there's nothing preventing a filter when you're breathing out, right? The whole point of this whole face mask thing from the very beginning was to protect others. So a face covering cannot have any holes in it like a button. That's why the filtering face piece, whether it's a button mask or an N95, protects the wearer only, does not protect others. But a solid face covering protects the wearer and it protects others. I hope that helps.
That sounds great, Kathy. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, to our audience. I know we went way over, but we know that we wanted to stay around for questions. And for those of you that were with us, thank you so much on behalf of Heffernan and for the entire Heffernan team. Thank you so much for participating today. We look forward to seeing you on our next webinar in the Heffernan family. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Hope this was helpful.
Bye now.